This week's episode of Millions of Screens is brought to you by I May Destroy You, the fearless HBO original series written by and starring Michaela Cole, and winner, just last night, of Breakthrough Short Form Series at the Gotham Awards. The Atlantic hailed the series as a brilliant, explosive consideration of modern sexual mores, and the New York Times calls Michaela's performance riveting and impossible to turn away from. The series explores questions of sexual consent in contemporary life and how, in the landscape of dating, we can make the distinction between liberation and exploitation. I May Destroy You, now streaming on HBO Max. Also, I May Destroy You, the #1 film on Letterboxd.
This is millions and millions of little screens.
Can't you shut up? I'm busy. Boy, what a great show.
Hello and welcome to Millions of Screens. I'm creative producer Leo Garcia, joined via Zoom by TV Awards editor Libby Hill and TV deputy editor Ben Travers. Today, we're going to be talking about football on Nickelodeon.
What?
The Nielsen 2020 streaming rankings, and why not throw in a little politics, just for good measure. Let's just skip right ahead to the clicker. Ben, you brought this to my attention. I was completely unaware of this, but over the weekend, in a sign of corporate synergy, the Saints-Bears playoff game was simulcast on Nickelodeon. And for those who haven't seen some of these images, essentially, they just added a bunch of cartoon-esque graphics to the game itself and highlights. There are puffs of smoke. There's slime. Ben, what does this mean for the future of sports and corporations? And are we going to see football on Peacock? We probably already exists. Where's the next place that football ends up?
I mean, you name it, it's going to be on there. It seems like I will preface this by saying that
as a Bears fan,
as a reluctant, eyes wide open, self-hating Chicago Bears fan, I will say that I think the Nickelodeon broadcast was fantastic. Everything I've read about it, all of the reactions to it, the few video clips I've been able to watch, look like a much more enjoyable experience than the actual broadcast that I had to endure on CBS. And as someone who has muted most sports announcers, most games that I've watched, which are quite a few for the last at least 5 years, I fully support any sort of change being made to live sports broadcasting. Like they are so often atrocious that, you know, giving people options is I mean, honestly, just the least they can do. And what we're seeing now, especially in, you know, possibly most egregiously, or depending on how you look at it, beautifully highlighted by the Nickelodeon broadcast, is, you know, an extension of corporate synergy where Viacom is looking at all of its brands, Viacom CBS, I should say, now that the merger is complete. They're looking at all their brands. They're trying to figure out what is the most successful way for those brands to exist. They're trying to spread the wealth, you know, as much as they possibly can. And NFL games, live sports in particular, but NFL games most of all, they make up like half, if not more, of the most watched programs every single year. And even if the ratings decline by, you know, 2%, 5%, they're still like head above heels in terms of live viewers. They'll make up viewership on their other platforms with people who catch up on VOD, but the ad dollars are most precious for people who are watching live. So the NFL games are extremely important. And this Nickelodeon broadcast of a Bears game that is literally available for free on CBS if you have a digital antenna, or, you know, obviously if you have satellite cable packages, this still got 2.061 million viewers, which is a 245% increase over last year's Nickelodeon ratings in a comparable window, as they're described in the CBS released. And it's the most watched program on the channel in nearly 4 years. Like, 2 million viewers. And that's not a huge percentage of the actual viewership for the game. So, like, to see that kind of mark a success for Nickelodeon, I can only assume we'll continue to see more of this stuff in the future. And what's exciting in that regard is stuff like Nickelodeon, how much fun they can have with it, with the slime zone and the end zone, with the little graphics that they add, with young Sheldon explaining to the audience different penalty calls. But to me, I've also noticed that like when the college football championship aired on Monday, if you logged onto the ESPN app to watch it, you could also watch the game with the home team announcers. So like the radio broadcast from Ohio State, the radio broadcast from Alabama. If you didn't want to listen to the people who were doing the national broadcast, which can't blame you, you can have your hometown team and your side. All the Buckeye fans will be commiserated along with the announcers at the same time. So they're coming up with kind of new, innovative ways to access things. And on the one hand, it seems good and healthy and wonderful because we get these different kind of presentations, and the traditional way that it's done has been shaken up, which I really like. On the downside, you might get less original programming or less creative decision-making on specific networks that instead are just following the ratings and being like, well, this may have nothing to do with football. We may already have a channel in our portfolio or 6 broadcasting this game, but we'll broadcast it too because we'll just get higher ratings that way, which also creates a pretty strong dependency on the NFL, which has its own problems. So that's the end of my spiel for now. Sorry about that. Sports.
No, but I mean, this isn't necessarily something new. I mean, I think that the Turner family of networks, we've been seeing that more and more with the March Madness, right? Like,
yeah, it was all Turner, and now it's all owned by Warner Media, so perhaps March Madness could extend to, in the future, HBO Max or other Warner-owned viewing platforms.
Right. I suppose the difference here is that the Bears game was simulcast on Nickelodeon.
Right. So, like, the March Madness games are typically different games on each network while all of March Madness is there. And this was the same game on many networks at the same time. Just with different tweaks. Like little poofs of air coming up behind speedy players.
Maybe we should just go back to having 3 networks. Like, maybe we only have enough good programming for 3 networks, and we should just dial it all the way back. Or we can keep our 450 networks and just show the same 3 shows at any given time.
I'm just excited for the first time someone is concussed during a game and they show the little birds going around the person's head. Like, it's like cracked and there's just like little birds going around the skull.
Yeah, that's a really good one. Or they're carried off the field, so they when they're showing the replays, they insert like Wile E. Coyote, like painting the tunnel on the wall, and it'll just make all of that long-term brain injuries hilarious. And
find a way to market
lighter the mood.
The NFL needs to find a way to market CTE to kids so that kids are okay with it from the jump.
I mean, in a very realistic way, this is a method for the NFL to engage with younger viewers, make the game accessible to them, and make them more likely to continue to breed talent to play in the league. So, like, it's absolutely, that is a problem. And as somebody who's already conflicted about watching the NFL, especially during a pandemic, the guilt is strong inside of me. But
good, that's what we're going for.
But now we need to brainstorm other Viacom properties that we could use for this. Can we do like pop-up football? And it's like every time the little thing pops up.
I would actually watch the shit out of that.
Yeah.
I mean, if there were no announcers and just pop-up videos on VH1, that would absolutely work. The Comedy Central thing seems easy. Just bring in 2 comedians for each team, like from each hometown team, as like fans that also provide commentary. MTV, I don't fucking know.
Just jams, baby.
Concert in the background. Just give it a soundtrack.
Just jock jams constantly. You just have a DJ score the game. Do you remember like when they used to do rock and jock, and they do like there just be a DJ the whole time providing the soundtrack, and like that's all you need, just a DJ providing the soundtrack for the whole game.
Wow.
Maybe just every game would have like a halftime show equivalent of the Super Bowl, where like produced by MTV, and that was like their main tie-in. So like they're just again continuing to try to make it more of an event that you must watch and attract a different fan base.
I just love the idea of a DJ throwing on like some Leonard Cohen after Ben Roethlisberger throws his 4th interception on Sunday night.
Watching Big Ben cry on
Oh.
Nickelodeon would have been the best.
I never realized why I needed a 65-inch TV until Big Ben was crying.
Till those tears started streaming, and you're like, oh, I can see them so clearly and so brightly. Like they're coming out of the TV.
Each tear was like the size of an apple on my television. They were huge.
They were huge. They were huge.
What are we talking about? We're talking about Nielsen streaming ratings. That's right.
How are we not TV executives?
Guys, Nielsen released their ranking of the top content on streaming platforms. And I think some of the shows, there are no surprises here. The Office was the most viewed series when you include both archival and new series, with an average of, a total of 57.13 billion minutes. That's a lot. That's 45% more than the second ranked show, which is Grey's Anatomy. We've had some time to look at these results. What surprised you in these numbers? There's obviously things like Tiger King that are sort of like huge cultural zeitgeisty things. But looking at these numbers, what surprised both of you? Libby, I know you had a thought about Tiger King.
We hear a lot about, obviously we heard a lot about Tiger King all year, but it was some solace to me that like roughly people only spent a little more time watching Tiger King collectively than they did watching New Girl, which is an old high quality sitcom that only brings joy to people as opposed to animal exploitation and murder and Shut Up, Ben.
I don't know. New Girl can be pretty frustrating. That whole Jess and Nick thing, that was rough.
I mean, there were some rough seasons in there. I'm not gonna lie.
I was also quick to point out that New Girl just barely edged out The Blacklist and Vampire Diaries.
I will tell the people what I told you, Leo, and that is that my parents need to watch something, and if you take The Blacklist from them, what are they going to go to? The Vampire Diaries? No.
Tell the people.
Well, if you can't watch Blue Bloods, Leo, I don't see how I can convince my parents.
If I can't be bothered to review Blue Bloods season 11, how are people going to know if they should watch it or not?
I will also add that I'm pretty sure I account for at least 1 billion of those Great British Bake Off minutes.
So you're 1/13th of all the Great British Baking Show of minutes is Libby Hill.
Yes.
I'll just run through the top 10. These were of original series. Ozark #1 with 30 billion minutes watched. Then Lucifer, The Crown, Tiger King, The Mandalorian, which is the only spot in the top 10 not occupied by a Netflix series, The Umbrella Academy, The Great British Baking Show, Boss Baby, Back in Business, Longmire, and You.
Me?
You.
Ben.
Me.
It's like when Time had their Person of the Year, and it was a mirror. And you were the Person of the Year. You.
I will say that a lot of these shows in the top 10 either came out early in the year or late last year, and then cap like You, which we're trying to talk about, the Penn Badgley show that used to be on Lifetime, that I believe debuted almost on the last day of 2019. So then, it makes sense that would have all this time in 2020 to accrue enough minutes to beat out certain things that might have come out later. But The Crown clocking in third place with 16 billion minutes, despite coming out in December?
Well,
early.
It probably also includes people going back and watching older seasons, correct?
Well, I would agree with that, but I would still think that the bulk of the watching or the viewing would have come around the same time. Like they would have been revisiting it to get ready for the new one, or just absorbing the new one. But that being said.
But yeah, to that extent, you see Ozark up there so high, but you are looking at Ozark coming out at the end of March, as compared to like something like The Crown, which came out in November. And there's a marked difference between how many people watched. And I'm wondering if that is a straight popularity game or if that is, timing.
Right. Yeah. I think timing would have to play into it. But to pivot a little bit toward the movie portion of this list, which I find to be extremely telling. Obviously, the minutes accrued from a TV series, assuming people like the show enough to watch all of it, and if it's this popular, then you would think that they would. That's going to amass much more minutes with less viewers. So the fact that Frozen 2 is the number one movie on here with 14 billion minutes, and that would clock it in at fifth on the original series list, and barely get it onto the top 10 acquired series list, and these are all technically acquired movies on here that made the top 10. That goes to show that you can rack up a lot of minutes in a short amount of time, even as a TV show. But the thing that this says to me the most is there are 7 Disney Plus movies on this top 10 list, as opposed to the other 2 lists where it's acquired series and original series. 9 of the 10 original series are from Netflix. 10 of the 10 acquired series are from Netflix, which emphasizes both the dominance that Netflix has on the streaming world in particular, as well as the inroads that Disney Plus is making. But the movies, speaks to kind of the importance of acquired content. Frozen 2 is number 1. Moana is number 2. The next Disney Plus movie is Onward, which was their Pixar movie that came out early in the year. It premiered in theaters before the pandemic and did okay, but then quickly came out on Disney Plus, which helps explain some of the boost. Then they've got Hamilton, as well as that's it. Then they've got the live action version of Aladdin, Toy Story 4, and Zootopia. But Hamilton had 6 billion minutes watched according to Nielsen, whereas Frozen 2 had 14.9. It's just such a massive difference in terms of what people are watching and how important some of these library titles are. But it also goes to show that today Netflix announced that they were having a venture of having one movie come out every week, one new movie come out on Netflix every week. And that, to me, shows, one, that they recognize that they don't have a huge library, so they need to start pumping out movies to help fill out their own library to help compete with these older libraries. 2, Netflix isn't as worried about the kind of long-term benefits of some of these things. Obviously, you want to have something that people will revisit every year, like we saw the Christmas Chronicles and the Christmas Chronicles 2, both circulating in the top 10 over Christmas. But they need to be on, the cutting edge. They need to have the new cool show that keeps people subscribing, as opposed to Disney Plus, which can lean on something like Moana and be like, listen, I know your kids want to watch Moana 16 times a day. You can't unsubscribe. Netflix understands that it needs to build out that library while still staying, current. And movies are a pretty good way to do that, because they're shorter, you can produce them quickly, they can create a lot of buzz, and they might disappear quicker, but they're still, extremely valuable piece of entertainment. So I expect to see, as Libby pointed out when we first discussed this, I expect to see this list pivot a bit in the coming years as Disney Plus, Netflix, and especially now HBO Max really put a lot of focus on movies in streaming world.
I just want to note that Frozen 2, the runtime is an hour and 43 minutes. If you were to add up those billions of minutes, it was watched to completion 144 million times.
Seems low.
That seems low, but that's how my bad math might have worked out.
No, so I was looking at that, and one thing that I can't get over is the inclusion of Spencer Confidential in that list.
Hell yeah. Also a January release, by the way.
Yeah. But the other thing is, all of those animated movies, the one thing that they have in common is there are none older than 2016. So I don't know if that's a reflection at all at how old the children who are watching things are. But yeah, before that, there's nothing on there. And so it's these recent releases that, as though children are a goldfish and they only remember the most recent movie they watched.
A question I have from my dumb, rude brain, and maybe one of you can answer this, is when we see
Probably
something like Bridgerton, they announced that it had 63 million viewers. It rocketed to the number 5 spot all time on Netflix's charts. Obviously, that was a December release, but why aren't shows like Bridgerton or Queen's Gambit showing up here? Are Netflix's numbers wrong?
Well, again, remember Netflix metrics are a little different when they're announcing how many people have watched something. They're counting, I don't remember at this point.
2 minutes.
2 minutes?
2 minutes? Yeah, it's 2 minutes of viewing. So that's saying that 64, 65 million people watched 2 minutes of Bridgerton. And if 64 million people watch 2 minutes, that's only 128
minutes.
million
They're not even getting on those. They're not even in the 20s.
Yeah.
You gotta get to the billions.
Yeah, it's not even going to make the movie list. So, like, that's definitely part of it. I also agree that I think the timing is definitely a part of it, because I do believe that Bridgerton, if we trust the Netflix self-released top 10 lists, it's been sustaining in the top 10 list long enough that it seems like people are both still discovering and finishing that show. So I would expect to see that, again, if this was reframed outside of the calendar year and more around, a show release schedule, or just buy an individual show over a certain, or over their first 3 months or 6 months or something, that might have a better chance of getting in. Queen's Gambit is an interesting question, though, because it came out early enough compared to something like The Crown.
I don't know. I like information, no matter how flawed and limited it is. And it is worth mentioning that to a certain extent, these are limited numbers. You'll see the streamers complain that this does not accurately reflect all of the different ways that people can consume their content, including on phones or like laptops. They are, Nielsen is focusing primarily on TV sets. Also, it is exclusively focused on US audiences and not those in other countries.
It also goes to show that, this isn't the full story by any means. Like, let alone, the numbers aren't necessarily, 100% reflective, if even 50% reflective of what is being watched the most on a streaming service, but it also doesn't illustrate the streaming service's priorities. Lucifer only made it, I believe, 2 seasons on Netflix after it moved over from Fox. It's definitely over now, and according to Nielsen's original series, Lucifer is the second most popular show on streaming over the past year, so you would think, instinctively, that Netflix would prioritize that and renew it for as long as humanly possible. But that ignores what is truly valuable to a network, or to a streamer like Netflix at this point, which is growing its subscriber base. And Lucifer, as well as a lot of these acquired series, was a broadcast series. It was not necessarily one of those kind of must-see, must-have titles that was driving people to subscribe, so much as it was like a bonus option for them to just have while they were waiting for something better to come along. And I know that don't stick the Lucifer fan base on me. I know they are rabid and huge and intense, and there's a good number of you, and you all want it to continue. That being said, if it really was the only thing that mattered was how many minutes people watched of a show, then you better believe that Lucifer would have continued, and it's not. So that tells you what is, kind of focused on at Netflix.
I will say, Lucifer had 3 seasons on Fox before it was canceled. Netflix picked it up. It has had 2 seasons since, and is getting a 6th and final season.
Oh, it is getting a 6th and final.
Is.
I thought the 6th
that was announced in July.
Aired. Oh my mistake.
Yeah. Well, you're wrong, and it's very important that we include those moments in the podcast.
Always.
Guys, last week we recorded the podcast on Tuesday before the events that occurred in DC on Wednesday, the attempted coup by the MAGA brigade, the president's being banned from Twitter. All this stuff happened after we recorded. But one thing that I did want to sort of talk about, which ties into all that, which was last week, for the first time since September of 2000, both CNN and MSNBC outperformed Fox News in terms of numbers. And CNN had its most highly viewed day on Wednesday, January 6th. I just wanted to sort of open up the floor. It was like, will this end? This idea of like, we're all glued to our television sets 24 hours to make sure the idiot in charge doesn't do something even more idiotic. Will these numbers dwindle in a quote unquote boring Biden presidency? And not that we are political reporters generally, but what does this say for Fox News moving forward? It seems like they're losing their base, either to hopefully some people who are seeing the errors of their ways and moving to the quote unquote centrist news outlets, or to the people who are doubling down and moving over to OANN and Newsmax. A lot to parse there. My question to you is, how are you guys doing after Wednesday? Because I've been struggling to get work done.
I opted, and this is because I know I'm when we talked about this beforehand, I was sort of a person who's like, what is the future of 24-hour news cycles? And part of that, it comes from the fact that I didn't turn my TV on once last week regarding the events at the Capitol, because I know what that is. I know what the 24-hour news cycle is. It's just going to be the same 6 people there saying things, saying that we don't know much, live footage of police cars in the distance. I know what disaster coverage looks like on 24-hour news networks, which is not to say that something like Twitter or online news sources are better, but I feel like I'm able to pick and choose the voices that I am hearing from in a more specific way, which leads me to something that I know that Leo has more thoughts on, which is, I think so much of the 24-hour news channels are dependent on the talent that they have and the guests that they bring in. One of the reasons that I think Fox News ratings faltered last week is because no one has aligned themselves as closely with the president as they have. Even as in the last 18 months, you have seen more upstart outlets like OANN.
Well, they've been hedging the past 2 to 3 years, where like you have the Chris Wallaces of the world try to be respectable newsmen,
right?
And then you have Hannity and Carlson going nuts on their opinion shows.
Yeah, they're the true believers, who will I assume eventually end up bringing big money to OANN or having their own radio empires like Rush Limbaugh. So Fox News bet big on Trump supporters and on Trump, and they invested heavily for the last 5 years. And if the current president goes down in a ball of flames, then it will take Fox News with them, because at a certain point, they can't be trusted by the left or center because of the alliances that they've shown over the last 5 years. And now they can't be trusted by the far right because of their alliances in the last 10 days. It's a lose-lose situation, and it couldn't happen to nicer people. But also, to that extent, like they're not the only guilty parties here. There's a reason I didn't turn on MSNBC, and it's something we spoke in the podcast about previously, and that's that, the most liberal, because I am one of those West Coast elites, born in South Dakota, West Coast elites. I don't turn on MSNBC because they bring in a lot of centrists who toe the DNC party line, but say stupid things. Or they have Lincoln Party Republicans coming in. They have Claire McCaskill coming in, and they're hearing from all these people. And I don't want to hear from all those people, because you know what? I've been hearing from all those people for the last 25 years, and it's not good enough for me anymore. So I go to Twitter, where I can hand choose who I want to hear from. And I can hear from those MSNBC personalities who aren't allowed to really espouse the truly liberal views they have on the network. They have to take to, the internet to do that. I don't know if our generation will return to 24-hour news, because I don't know if our generation can find our mouthpieces there. What was once about information, and I remember, I am old enough to remember the rise of 24-hour news with the first Gulf War, with OJ, with all of that. But I also feel like I'm old enough to see us growing out of it to a certain extent. I've talked for a very long time, and I need someone else to talk now, and I have no idea how to transition to that.
Well, I would briefly say that I 100% believe what you're saying, want to believe what you're saying, and yet still fear that Fox News will be absolutely fine because they've been working for years at crafting whatever narrative fits their agenda and convincing viewers to go along with that narrative. So I am living in terror of their expertise of manipulation and believe that they'll probably be able to sustain the people who eventually see that the Republican Party that they've supported for so long still needs a mouthpiece in the news. And when there's real issues being dealt with in DC politics, they need to turn to Fox News to see how their party is addressing and interpreting them, while still a wide swath of the diehard loyalist Trump supporters go off to those kind of extremist fringes. But that being said, everything you're saying about not watching the news as a member of this generation applies to me, because I've been a cord cutter for 8 years now. I think the few times I've watched cable news in the last 8 years is when there's been an election going on, and I'm trying to get results or hear some sort of immediate reaction and interpretation of what's going on. And even then, I'm still usually clinging to Twitter and the political junkies that I follow on Twitter more so than I am actually trusting or waiting for the news on TV to give me any sort of information. And when the Capitol siege happened, I was doing the same thing. I followed a lot of it through Twitter. I tried to log into some CNN coverage online and watch some stuff that was live, and then read a lot of people who had reactions to what they were watching to kind of interpret how the news handled it. And I do think that what happened on Wednesday showed that we've had some growth in terms of how news anchors respond to Trump and respond to kind of his general danger, his hate-mongering and fear-mongering tactics, and that was encouraging to hear and to see, because some of them didn't show his video, which Biden had actually requested them to show, and some of them, when they were showing it, were editing it live. Some of them were immediately following up with saying, listen, I know we just showed that, but this isn't true, and this isn't true, and this isn't true, and this isn't true. And seeing that reaction and seeing that kind of discernment goes above and beyond what we were used to seeing when the Trump presidency began, in that every time he'd say anything, they flocked to it because they wanted the ratings and they wanted the coverage. And it's really hard to say what the next year, 4 years will be like in terms of news ratings and how they'll adapt if the ratings do drop, because it is, as it's being widely described, as more boring politics as usual. But they'll adapt. They will continue to adapt. They will continue to find ways into these stories and these topics that are salacious and demanding of your attention in a way that may or may not justify that attention. And the one thing that I'll say about the ratings on Wednesday, everyone who heard what was happening knew they had to see what was happening for themselves. And that is a rare instance when it comes to real world reporting. Like there's always going to be tragedies and there's always going to be breaking news, but something like that is something you have to see with your own eyes, and people tuned into the news to do that because that's what they typically do. I don't think that's going to keep happening. And I'm not going to pretend to know how they'll pivot to make sure that they can keep their quarterlies steady. So
I'll find a way.
I'll be on Twitter, an equally toxic place.
But toxic in a different way.
Yeah, it's sort of telling. You mentioned the rise of 24-hour news, and I always associate it with another, like Chuck Schumer said that January 6th, 2021 will now be added to the list of dates that will live in infamy in American history. And what I always equate the rise of the 24-hour news cycle to is 9/11, and the idea that, as Ben just mentioned, it was an event that everyone had to witness it in real time as much as you could, and then you were sort of lost in your confusion and thoughts, and you sort of needed some constant presence to be like, what is will there be answers? And I think that sort of gave rise to this 24-hour news cycle, and then they didn't know what to fill it with for so long that it sort of became this awful albatross of like, something happens, let's go there and give you nothing for 8 hours. And then Trump came along, and he sort of filled it in an accurate way because he is such a fucking disaster, that they were able to sort of cover it in the same way that they covered 9/11 for 4 years. Now, Ben, you mentioned the way that it's heartful to know that the news reporters could cover Trump. Trump is the
9/11 of people is just like, yeah, that seems out.
Yeah. We're getting to 300,000 infections, 3,000 deaths a day, so.
Yeah, it all checks out. But it was somewhat heartful to see that reporters could change their tone on Trump. But maybe from my, liberal bubble ears, I thought it was all too little too late. I thought on election night when Brian Williams cut away from Trump saying he won the next day after the election, it all had an air of, and I referenced this before, but like it all felt like the moment in Home Alone when Kevin comes out of the house and says, "You hear that? I'm not afraid anymore. I'm not afraid anymore." And like that's what all the press was doing once Trump quote unquote lost the election. Like when it was in hand in Georgia, and it's like, he's going to lose. We don't have to pay attention to him anymore. But they gave him so much oxygen for 4 years. And you kind of wish any of the networks had done that at any point over the course of the previous four years. And I think Libby was mentioning this, and we've talked about this at length off pod. But for being the quote unquote liberal answer to Fox News, there is nothing more infuriating than watching the cavalcade of Lincoln Project folks come on to MSNBC, Michael Steele, Steve Schmidt. It's like, one of you ran the RNC, one of you ran the McCain-Palin campaign. Why are you the constant voices? And I understand how those programs work, where you just have like contributors who are going to be on every hour on the hour. But why are you giving them so much time? Truly insane. There's no way that Fox News is giving that much time to our most left people. Like, that's not happening. Theirs is an echo chamber. And meanwhile, because we're quote unquote supposed to be better, we're offering some kind of both sidesism. If I want to watch liberal news, I want to watch liberal news.
That's because every time they have Pete Buttigieg on, he roasts them and they don't know what to do. So they can't have even the most kind of centrist liberals on over there. But I think that's the thing. Claire McCaskill has so much time to show up on MSNBC and comment because she lost her election. Like, she's not the person I need to hear from. Also, she's not very trans rights, and Claire can go fuck herself. But I
well, Libby, you do know that's identity politics that doomed the Democrats.
Yeah, that's how we lost
not getting the blue wave they wanted. And now we're a politics podcast. Yeah. I hope you guys are ready.
Film and politics.
Well, but I mean, I think this is the biggest question facing news as an outlet, like TV news in general, as time ticks away, as you know, days turn to months, turn to years, turn to decades, which is, will we ever be able to trust it and rely on it again? Is there a core group of people who will go back to it? And if so, why and how? Like, are we permanently moving on from this sort of thing because it's just been so tarnished and trashed that we're just not gonna pay attention to it anymore? And given the way that people can consume news these days, and given the way that they all want to have their own perspectives acknowledged, if not catered to, or exclusively voiced, where are they going to find that? And again, I don't have a great answer for it, but watching the way that it's being handled today, it doesn't give you a lot of hope that there's going to be some sort of unifying solution anytime soon.
There's no going back. We're not going to have another Walter Cronkite. And if you look back to the age of Walter Cronkite, like, those were all just old white men. It felt like they were universal. But if you look at it, they weren't universal. And I say that as someone who loves Walter Cronkite. But honestly, Ben, if it helps, this ties directly into the NFL on Nickelodeon. Everyone wants the same thing. They just want it catered specifically to them. They want it to have the puck highlighted, the hockey puck highlighted, or they want little animated slime every time someone scores a touchdown, or they want dancing robots on Fox, which I've never understood. They want what they want, and they want it how they want it. And because we live in this age where there is so much customization available, we're never going back to that kind of singular trusted source of news, because I think that illusion is broken. There is no such thing as impartiality. There's no such thing as... It's hard to believe there's such thing as truth anymore, because it's so subjective to a person's eyes. Like, that's why I don't know what to think about 24-hour news networks. I think that weirdo stations or weirdo outlets like OANN will become more... I mean, we saw this with political websites too. Like, it used to be like Drudge, and now there's Breitbart, and there's all of these. There are so many more echo chambers now, which is nice because people can find representation for the views that they have, but it's also awful because awful people can find representation for the views that they have. But we're never going back to the singular source, because it's just so easy to manipulate that singular source. And,
well, that's politics.
I'm sure that can be cut into something vaguely relevant for the podcast.
Millions of Screens is a production of the Penske Media Corporation and IndieWire. Our theme music features excerpts of the classic YouTube video Bjork Talking About TV and Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Our editor-in-chief is Dana Harris-Brightson, our publisher is James Israel, and our executive editor is Ann Donahue. Our favorite Nickelodeon shows are Clarissa Explains It All, Rocco's Modern Life, and The Angry Beavers. Millions of Screens endorses Leo, insert your favorite Nickelodeon show here.
I think that went well.
That's the kind of you can't do that on television humor this podcast so sorely needs. You can find us on Twitter at A Million Screens, at Midwest Spitfire, at Ben T. Travers, and at Leo Adrian Garcia. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, so leave a review and let us know what you think. This is Ben, Libby, and Leo reminding you that you shouldn't let poets lie to you.
You shouldn't let poets lie to you.
Ain't nothing wrong with a couple of cold brews and a cool podcast.